supports the right of university students, faculty, and staff to engage in protected speech and assembly. The opinion expressed throughout this event of those of the individual speakers do not reflect any official policy, statement, or values of Towson University. The university has established guidelines to ensure that the expressive activities do not unreasonably disrupt university operations, violate the protected speech activity of others, endanger the safety of others, or risk destruction of university policy. As stated in the policy on time, place, and manner, speakers shall not be subject to harassment, nor shall others' right to hear the speaker be infringed. At the same time, members of the university community shall have the right to peacefully protest any such activity, so long as the activity being protested is not disruptive. Activities that violate this policy may be stopped or moved to another location by university officials. In other words, behavior destructive to the speaker will not be tolerated. Any individual or group in violation of the policy will be escorted out of the room by TU Police Department. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome every single one of you to the first event for the Towson White Student Union. I'm happy to see that we have a totally packed house, which is great. Unfortunately, not everyone in the community gets to come see this event, but for those of you who made it in, I just wanted to say welcome. And I'm looking forward to everyone getting to hear Mr. Jared Taylor speak. Mr. Taylor is a hero of mine. For the past 20 years, so about as long as most of us have been alive, he's been working with American Renaissance, which is a publication and also an online website, which discusses the idea of race realism. That you do not have to be made of hate to simply acknowledge that there are differences between different groups of people. That the idea of political correctness has so much silenced the idea that we can talk about basic fundamental differences and similarities between groups of people that it's almost insane. Which the idea that this group of the White Student Union is controversial, I think is proof of that. But Mr. Taylor, he's a Yale-educated man who also got his master's degree studying in Paris. He's well-educated, he's a great hero of mine, and I look forward to everyone getting to hear what he has to say. Everybody welcome Mr. Jared Taylor.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I very much appreciate this opportunity to speak at Towson University. And thank you all for coming out on this rather inclement evening. I'm very glad to see all of you here. I gather that the issue to be discussed today is whether or not there could or should be a white student union at Towson University. And I think the larger issue really is whether or not whites as a group have legitimate interests that they should form organizations to defend. As far as the student union here at Towson is concerned, I think a logical point of departure for investigating whether or not such a union would be legitimate is to see what kinds of organizations already exist at this university. There are many, many organizations. I did a little research on my own, and I discovered the following. There is an organization for Asians. There's one for South Asians. There's one for Vietnamese, for Filipinos. There are 3 Chinese organizations. There's an organization for Caribbean students, one for Muslims, Iranians, Saudi students. There are 2 organizations for Jewish students, 2 Hispanic groups, and there are 5 groups for blacks. And then there's something called the Minority Science and Technology Club. I assume that's primarily directed to all people but whites. Then as far as, aside from these ethnic or racial groups, there are all sorts of interest groups here at Towson. And the interests can run from anything from interest in criminal justice to skating. So there is an enormous number of student groups that cater to different interests, different nationalities and ethnicities. Now, what could possibly be the basis for opposing the organization of a white student union? Can you think of any other demographic group that might cause opposition? Just judging from the list I read out to you, it doesn't sound like any other demographic group would cause any trouble at all. And after all, we live in an era that praises tolerance and inclusiveness. And how can it be that whites and only whites should not be tolerated and should be excluded? If that is to be the policy, there must be awfully, awfully good reasons for that policy. What might those reasons be? Well, I think some people might argue that, well, whites are a majority, and therefore they don't need to organize. They have no interest because they are the majority. But that thinking doesn't operate in any other context. If in the November elections, the Democrats become a majority in the House of Representatives, are they going to say, well, we're the majority now, we have no interest, we don't need to organize? No, they will organize very carefully to advance their interests as the majority. Also, on this campus, according to the statistics I was able to find, women are 76% of the student body. Women are a majority. But because they are a majority, does that mean they cannot organize? They have no interests? Of course not. The fact that one is a majority certainly does not mean that one does not have interests and one should not legitimately organize. That leaves only one thing, and that's race. Whites are not supposed to organize simply because of their race. Now, in an era in which we are supposed to be fighting racial discrimination, and I'm sure Towson University is very, very serious about fighting racial discrimination. If you are the only group that is told, no, no, you must not organize or have a student union because of your race, that is a spectacular example of racial discrimination and is reason enough, in my mind, to form a union to combat that kind of racial discrimination. Now, what are some of the obvious interests whites might have as whites that might be taken up by a student union? One thing that's entirely obvious, certainly in a university context, is the whole question of what's called affirmative action. Well, to give affirmative action its real name, it is racial preferences. And the way racial preferences work is that for certain protected classes, standards are lowered so that they will be admitted to university rather than people of another race. In the case of universities, study after study has shown that blacks and Hispanics can be admitted to university with standard test scores, SAT scores, 100 to 200 points lower out of 1,600 than whites, and with grade point averages equivalently lower. On February 14th, 2011, an organization called the Center for Equal Opportunity did yet another study of this kind. And it concluded in the following way. CEO of that organization, Linda Chavez, who is herself Hispanic, she put it in these terms. She says, the study shows that many, many students are rejected in favor of students with lower test scores and grades, and the reason is they have the wrong skin color. She's talking overwhelmingly about whites. Whites have the wrong skin color. Professor Stephen Farron is an American professor who's now active in South Africa. He did a huge study of admissions to law school, and he compared the GPAs, the test scores of those who admitted, with the racial admission ratios. And what he found was that only 1/5 of the blacks who were admitted to law school would have been admitted had they been held to the standards required of whites. Only 1/3 of Puerto Ricans would have been admitted, and only 1/2 of Hispanics. The rest were admitted because standards were selectively lowered so as to admit them. And who were the students that were not admitted to those law schools? Overwhelmingly, white students were not admitted so as to admit non-white law students. This is typical of educational institutions throughout the United States. Are any of you aware of a single university or educational institution that boasts of the fact that it ignores race, that it admits strictly on the basis of qualifications? There's not a single one. Every one of them. Not only do they take race into consideration, most of them boast about it. This can only be seen as systematic racial discrimination against whites. If any other racial group in this country were being treated in this manner, in this openly discriminatory manner, it would be a national scandal. It would be a coast-to-coast uproar. Imagine blacks or Hispanics or Asians, anyone else being treated in this fashion. And when it comes to affirmative action, racial preferences, I find it even more astonishing that recent immigrants can benefit from racial preferences. That means someone who has arrived in this country just last year may, for strictly racial reasons, get preferences over a white person whose family has been in this country paying taxes for generations. How can that be fair? By the same token, non-citizens can benefit from racial preferences and be given the nod over U.S. citizens. Obviously, this kind of systematic discrimination is something that should be of great interest to whites and would be the kind of thing that a white student union can entirely legitimately discuss. We find the same kind of discrimination on the job in terms of affirmative action. Practically every large company in this country has what's called a chief diversity officer. That person's job is to try to put pressure throughout the organization to hire as many non-whites as possible. And as an example, Walmart and Ford Motor Company. These are just two examples of major American corporations that require reports from all of their suppliers on the number of non-white employees and non-white management staff. They don't require reports on automation technology or whether they're following the best accounting standards. They are putting pressure on their suppliers to hire non-whites. In the case of Walmart, if you want to be a law firm that gets Walmart's business, they will grade you on three things. One is price, the other is performance, and the other is how many non-white lawyers you have on your staff. In other words, you can be top of the heap in terms of price and performance. If you don't have enough non-white lawyers, you don't get Walmart's business. All of this puts enormous pressure to hire non-whites. The New York Times offers bonuses to its managers. The more non-whites they hire, the larger their bonus. Again, pressure to discriminate against whites. The opposite is never a problem, apparently. In the cities of Washington and Atlanta, in the public transportation system, no fewer than 96% of the bus drivers and train drivers are black in both of those cities. Now, does this mean white people are not interested in those jobs? In these times, white people are interested in just about any kind of job. These are good-paying, unionized jobs. And if they're 96% black, it's only because whites are being kept out, but no one seems to care. On the other hand, if a city is going to hire policemen or firemen, and they hire them by means of a test that has been very, very carefully designed so as to have no kind of bias, you squeeze every possible bias out of the test, and yet, if blacks or Hispanics don't pass it at the same rate, then, oh my gosh, it's racial discrimination, the test has to be thrown out, and a judge might very well order the city to hire blacks or Hispanics who have failed the test. Once again, a spectacular double standard. There are set-asides in municipal contracting, projects that are set aside for black-owned companies, Hispanic-owned companies. Also, there is protective bidding, so that if something goes out to bid, if a company is owned by a minority, then they can get the business, even if their bid is 10 or 15% higher than the bid of a white-owned company. This sort of thing is so systematic that we have the case of Mustafa Hefni. Now, Mustafa Hefni is a dark-skinned Egyptian. And Egyptians are classified by the Census Bureau, for reasons of its own, as white. If you're Egyptian, you're officially white. Well, Mustafa Hefni has discovered, after having been in the United States, there are no advantages to being white. He wants to be reclassified as black because there are so many professional advantages to being black. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, one of the reasons given for racial preferences in university admissions, for example, is to provide for diversity. We're told that diversity is a great strength. Some people would even say diversity is the greatest strength that the United States has. And of course, diversity is supposed to have a lot of different components: language, religion, nationality, ethnicity. But let's face it, the most important one is race. Now, the fact is, diversity of this kind isn't a strength. It's not a strength anywhere. The words racial conflict, racial tension, racial discrimination, all of those terms crop up very frequently in language in the United States today because diversity is a problem rather than a strength. It's a source of tension, conflict, and dissension. Let's consider just the workplace alone. In fiscal year 2007, the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that's the EEOC, they received no fewer than 39,876 formal complaints of racial and national origin discrimination. That's more than 150 of them every single workday. Now, in addition to the EEOC filings, there are states, counties, municipalities, corporations, universities. Every part of the government and the armed services has their own grievance procedure for racial discrimination charges. Employees can also, if they don't want to go through those procedures, they can file directly in federal court for racial discrimination. And every year, blacks alone file about 21,000 racial discrimination lawsuits in the federal courts. There's the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance, the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, and the state and local equivalents of all of these offices. They exist because diversity is such a source of problems and tensions and conflict. I suspect that if you counted up all of the racial discrimination filings throughout the United States and all the different venues available for formal filings of this kind, you would find hundreds of thousands of them. That's an enormous amount of effort, an enormous amount of heartache, all deriving from diversity, which is supposed to be a strength. Now, if diversity were inherently good, inherently valuable, inherently wonderful, why would we have to have the highly paid profession known as diversity consultant to manage it? Things that are inherently good, to enjoy them or to make the most of them, you don't need a consultant. You don't need a consultant to make the most out of good tasting food, beautiful weather, the affection of your friends. Those are inherently good things. Diversity requires consultants because diversity is hard. Diversity is difficult. It's because it's difficult for people to try to work and act and live together with people who are unlike themselves. Practically every survey of employees will find that not only are employees more comfortable working with people of the same race as themselves, they also prefer to work with people of the same sex and about the same level of education. And again, if diversity is this wonderful strength to which we should all be attracted, why is it that so many people avoid it when they get the chance? In their private lives, when people are entirely free to choose their associates, most people, they prefer homogeneity rather than diversity. Think about a backyard barbecue, or lounging around with friends, or a dinner party, or a church. When people are free to choose their associates, by and large, they do not choose this diversity, which is supposed to be such a great strength. Now, what about residential decision making? I'm sure you've all heard of white flight. This is the idea that if whites are living in a neighborhood and a certain number of non-whites show up, they up stakes and clear out and go to some neighborhood that is still majority white. And whites are routinely criticized for this. This is supposed to be a horrible racist act on their part. The fact is, it's very much a universal thing. There are now many what were established black neighborhoods where Hispanics have moved in. And blacks are very unhappy about this. They liked the neighborhood the way it was. They prefer the company and institutions of blacks, and they don't want them changed by the arrival of newcomers unlike themselves. And it can get considerably worse in terms of neighborhood integration. I don't suppose any of you heard about this, but in May of 2009, there was a federal indictment of 147 members of a Hispanic gang called the Barrio Hawaiian Gardens Gang. This is in the town of Hawaiian Gardens in California. What was this gang doing, this gang of Hispanics? They were systematically trying to clear every black person out of Hawaiian Gardens. That's what they thought of diversity. They called themselves a hate gang. They were murdering blacks, I beg your pardon. There's a Hispanic gang trying to clear all blacks out of their town. This was such a substantial undertaking that U.S. Attorney Thomas P. O'Brien, he called these arrests, quote, the largest gang takedown in United States history. In his view, this was bigger than Al Capone, bigger than John Dillinger, bigger than anything the Mafia ever did. And I suspect no one here has ever heard of it. Why would that be? It's because what was happening there, this ethnic cleansing of blacks by Hispanics, was such a shocking slap in the face to the idea that diversity is a strength that people just don't want to talk about it. This runs so counter to what we're told about diversity being a strength that we just better hide this news, even if it is the greatest gang takedown in all of American history. The same is true in prisons. Whenever there's a prison riot, by the time you get to the 12th or the 13th or maybe even the 15th paragraph, you find out that, well, yes, it was because of race. Prison riots are almost exclusively race riots. Generally, riots between blacks and Hispanics, but sometimes whites, Asians get involved. But again, we don't want to talk too much about this because we have this myth that diversity is a strength. Often even in high schools, when you have a large number of black and Hispanic students, you can have very serious race riots. Just a few days ago, Silverado High School in Victorville, California had a series, massive brawls between black and Hispanic students. I doubt you read about that. These things are almost never reported. And near the end of this news story, one of the administrators said, yes, this is a constant problem. This happens every year and we can't solve it. Well, you don't solve things by not talking about them. But that is the way America approaches any kind of spectacular evidence of this kind, that diversity is a weakness rather than a strength. Now, what does this question of diversity and the weaknesses of diversity have to do with the possible interests that a white student union might have? It has to do with the following. In 1960, the United States was about 90% white. Since that time, massive immigration from non-white countries has reduced the white majority to about 62, 63, 64%. The projection is that by the year 2042, whites will be a minority in the United States. From 60 to 42, that's just 82 years. Historically, that's a blink of an eye. Whites go from being 90% to being a minority. Now, were whites ever asked, do you folks want to be a minority? No, they won't. And I could I have your attention? Whites were never asked. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, could I have your attention, please?
As stated previously, folks, speakers shall not be subject to harassment nor shall others' right to hear the speaker be infringed. If any additional disruptions occur, you will be asked to leave. So that please hold some of the small talk and chat in your comments towards the end with each other in the hallway. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, whites were never asked about this. Now, is this a legitimate question for whites to talk about? Well, theoretically, ideally, whites aren't even supposed to notice that this is happening. However, it's very clear that other groups are certainly noticing. Here is what the Los Angeles Times of September 2nd, just a few days ago, they were quoting a Toby Chaudhuri. He's an immigrant from India, and he works as a political consultant. And this is what he had to say about the rise of Asian politicians all across the United States. He said, quote, "Here is a chance to define a young new century. These Asian candidates can take charge of the conversation about what is America." So these Asian politicians are going to take charge of the question of what is America. Well, they may have some competition from Hispanics. Here is Jorge Ramos. He is the anchorman of the Spanish language television network Univision. In a recent book, he wrote the following. He's talking about Hispanics, his own group. He says, "We are everywhere. There is no occupation or activity in this country that escapes our influence. This century is ours," says Jorge Ramos. Well, that's interesting. Asians are going to tell us what it means to be America. The century belongs to Hispanics. So where does that leave whites? Where does that leave black people, for example? Black people, for heaven's sake, have been here a whole lot longer than Asians and Hispanics. But Asians and Hispanics are going to tell us what America is all about? Well, as you all know, we are constantly being told to celebrate diversity. Well, we can see why Jorge Ramos celebrates diversity. That's because diversity means there are more of his people. That means his language, his heritage, his aspirations, his culture have a larger and more influential role to play in the United States. The same for Asians, the same for all of the groups that are coming to this country and who are the people who are reducing whites from a majority to a minority. Of course they're celebrating. But when you ask whites to celebrate diversity, what are you asking them to do? You're asking them to celebrate their dwindling numbers, their declining influence. You're supposed to be asking whites to say, "Great, we're giving our country away. We're just going to glimmer away. Hooray, hooray." I can't think of anything quite as sick as that. And the amazing thing is the number of whites who've been bamboozled and browbeaten into thinking that somehow just fading away is some sort of virtuous activity. Now, just to understand better what's going on, let's imagine the shoe on the other foot. Let's imagine that hundreds of thousands of poor and badly educated Americans, white Americans, were pouring across the border into Mexico. And let's imagine that they were insisting on instruction in school in English rather than Spanish. Let's imagine they were asking for ballot papers in English rather than Spanish. They were celebrating 4th of July rather than Cinco de Mayo, buying up newspapers, publishing in English. Television stations, radios, all publishing and broadcasting in English, and that there were so many of them coming in that they threatened to reduce Mexicans to a minority. Do you think the Mexicans could possibly be tricked into thinking that this was enrichment, this was diversity, that this was great? No, no. They wouldn't stand for it for a moment. This would be to them an impossible, unacceptable invasion of their country. And you would find the same reaction in every non-white country, anywhere in the world. Can you imagine, say, the Japanese, or the Nigerians, or the Pakistanis, the Costa Ricans, accepting this kind of wholesale demographic change that would change their country, transform their country, and reduce them to a minority? No. These things are impossible to imagine. Once again, we have a spectacular double standard that what is common sense and taken for granted for every other group is denied to whites. Just like the idea of a white student union here. Every other racial group, it's fine. Only whites. No, 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 not you guys. Everybody else is okay, but not you. Now I'll close with yet another reason why whites might have an interest in something like a white student union. It's this. Just about every time I speak at a university, someone will come up to the microphone and say, "I'm a white female, and I just don't think white people have anything to be proud of." Well, this is really breathtaking. It's very tragic in a way. Out of all of Western civilization, you have people who can't think of a single thing that they might take pride in. And again, this is something that is utterly unique. We cannot imagine a person of any other race, any other nationality saying, "I've got nothing to be proud of." Now I understand that one of the goals of the White Student Union will be to try to correct such deluded white points of view. But the fact that you can even have a tragic situation of something saying, "My group has nothing to be proud of," this goes to show you the kind of poisonous anti-white atmosphere that tends to pervade a university, not just this one, but throughout the entire country. And so to conclude, I'd just like to repeat really the two main points that I made, and that is, when every other group is encouraged and has the right to organize, whether it's on national lines, ethnic lines, racial lines, but only whites stir up organization. That itself is reason to wonder what's going on. And if the reason to oppose a white organization is strictly on the basis of race, in this era of absolutely crazed anti-racial discrimination, this is staggering hypocrisy. This is a spectacular injustice, and I think in Towson, it's about time it came to an end. Thank you very much. Yes, the question.
Oh, Mr. Taylor.
Yes, I'll be happy to take questions.
Okay.
And Mr. Feinbach will come by with a microphone.
If we can do this in an organized fashion, if people could just form a line in the center, I'll be holding the microphone and. Okay, let's back it up from the podium, everybody. Let's be organized. Excellent.
Diversity is bad.
Okay.
That's probably good.
If you could, no, this is fine, and please, if you could make it a question, please.
Yeah, we're not looking for any speeches, ladies and gentlemen, just a quick question.
All right, my question for you is, the purpose for this white student union, what exactly is the purpose? Because from my understanding and from what you said, you're not speaking about the accomplishments of Caucasian Americans or the accomplishment of this race or sort of the progression of the white race. You're more so speaking, from my understanding, is so much as the Caucasian race being the dominant race. And I had some key points, but because he said questions, that's why. But I do have key points I would like to ask, but that's my main thing. What is the purpose of this group? I don't care if it's a white organization, it could be an Asian group. My point is that when Caucasian Americans have a group, from history and from time has shown that it's not a productive group. It's a bonding. My question is, what is the purpose of this group? What is going to be the discussions in the group?
Well, I'm not going to be organizing this group. I'm saying that as a general matter, whites have clear interests that it behooves them to defend. Now, none of the interests that I talked about had anything whatsoever to do with dominating anybody. Not one of them. And it'll be ultimately Matt Heimbach who sets the tone for this group, but I can assure you that he has no interest whatsoever in wanting to dominate anybody or anything. Next question.
When will the statement be that where I can sort of not have a debate, but just have a
Give him the mic.
afterwards?
Hi, my name is Tiara Grant. I'm speaking on behalf of Morgan State University. And I'm for graduating from Yale University. But my question to you is, what are the rates of, I guess, just interaction with other multicultures in Yale University?
At Yale?
Yeah.
Well, I graduated in 1973, a long time ago. What the situation is now, I don't know, but it had groups very similar to the ones here in Towson. There were all sorts of groups for blacks or Asians or Hispanics. Now, like most universities and like most multiracial organizations and institutions, generally people keep to themselves. Most people who are white tend to have white friends. Most people who are Asian tend to have Asian. There are people who are not that way, of course. But generally, people tend to stick to themselves. It was the same at Yale. I imagine it's the same here.
Can I respond to that?
If we can just skip to one question, but you can feel free to get back in line.
Okay.
What is race? Because
Race.
I think it would be interesting to note that when my family came here, we were not classified as white.
Where did your family come from?
Italy.
You were always white.
Well,
You were always white. Europe is white people.
I think when people talk as though, excuse me, When people talk as though race is some sort of psychological construct or a sociological optical illusion, they only bring it up in this kind of context of delegitimizing any kind of white organization. No one, when black people want to organize and make a black group, nobody says, hey, you can't do that. There's no such thing as black. When Asians do that, no one says, no, there's no such thing as Asians. It's only when white people wish to organize, someone says, no, well, what's race anyway? Well, aside from that particular issue, everyone understands perfectly well what race is. Now, there may be some vague cases along the margins. Egyptians, I don't really consider them white, but the Census Bureau does. But the only time this notion of race being some sort of sociological optical illusion comes up is in an attempt to delegitimize any effort of whites to organize to defend their own interests.
Hi, Jacob Baker, I'm from CCBC Janesville. I was wondering, what did you mean by the term "our country," considering that you're not Native American, and this is
I don't quite understand what you mean by my not being American. Is anyone in this room an American? Well, all right. So you're saying that everyone in this room who's not an American Indian should clear out, including you?
I'm saying that
Then
if you're
why-
going to use terms to say ours, you have to recognize this country was never any of ours. And if we're going to offer
Excuse me. If that's your view, why are you here? Why you should be the first to leave. If you believe that you have no legitimacy in this country, if you genuinely believe that, then you should go someplace else. Now, the whole question.
I'm saying because a lot of people died and fought for me to want to stay here. Because I'm not leaving because my country did form on the foundation of blood. I'm staying to form it on the foundation of something else, freedom, enlightenment, truth.
Amen.
Now, many people will argue that, okay, the Indians were here first, so whites should have no complaints about being displaced by others. This, once again, is a spectacular double standard. If what happened to the Indians, becoming a minority, is a bad thing, and yet for whites to become a minority is a good thing, we're back to that usual double standard. If it's bad for whites, it's good. You got to make up your mind.
Not a double standard, it's minority.
Next question.
That's all I had to say. Thank you for coming.
Oh, my pleasure.
My name is Leah Bass, and I'm a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, which was founded on the campus of Howard University. The purpose of the organization is made because black women were not allowed to join sororities at that time. So my question for you is, how would you define oppression? Because that isn't something that I heard you speak about very much this evening, and I just kind of wanted to further understand what is your take and stance on what oppression is and how it can have an effect on one race.
Well, oppression can take all sorts of forms. Presumably, if one group dominates another, you find that in Arab countries. If the Shia Muslims are dominating the Sunnis, not letting them vote, not letting them have any kind of access to political power, that would be a form of oppression. In Saudi Arabia, they don't let women drive. You could say women are oppressed. In Saudi Arabia, they don't let Christians practice their religion. I would call that an oppression of some kind. There are different kinds of oppression all around the world. If one group is somehow putting pressure on some other group and denying it some sort of basic human right, that's how I would define oppression.
Hi, my question is, you're saying that diversity is a negative thing, has a negative effect. So I just want to know, so do you believe that Towson should be an all-white school? Like,
No.
do you believe in separate but equal? Because it seems like that's what you're saying.
What I believe in is complete freedom of association. And if that means that blacks prefer to live and study and work with blacks, marry other blacks, God bless them. If whites prefer to do that, they should have that right too. Now, for those who wish to live lives that are completely mixed, they should have that right too. All I'm saying is that most people, given the choice, will prefer the company of people like themselves. You'll find that in churches, for example. 90% of American churches are at least 85% one race. That's because when people are not forced by government or university or some kind of authority to mix in this diverse way, by and large, they prefer to be separate. Now, if people wish to mix, that's their business. All I'm saying is, if people wish to be separate, they should have that right, whether they're black, white, Asian, or anything at all.
Ray Winbush, Morgan State University.
Yes.
Mr. Taylor, people classified as white, such as yourself, comprise a global white minority, only comprise about 8 to 10% of the world's population. Do you think that any of your white supremacist ideology arises out of your conscious insecurity of being a part of a genetic minority when it comes to skin color? In other words, do you have a fear of a black planet?
First of all, I'd like to know, could you quote me anything at all that I've said that was white supremacist? No, let him speak, please. What have I said this evening? One thing that strikes you as white supremacy.
Well, you know, the previous speaker said about our country. This country belongs to Native Americans. My ancestors weren't allowed, we were taken by your ancestors.
Wait. What did I say? What did I
just said it.
You mean for me to say our country is white supremacy?
It is not your country, it belongs to Native Americans. I was taken here by my ancestors. Your ancestors brought us here. This is not, it belongs to Native Americans. African Americans have recognized that for many, many years.
Well, then, that's why I want to know, why do they stay? If you insist it belongs to the Indians, why do you stay? Look, first of all, the whole idea of white supremacy, there is nothing that I've said that indicates any kind of desire to dominate anybody else. White supremacy, if it has any meaning at all, presumably means that whites wish to rule over others. I have absolutely no desire to do that. As I said before, I believe in freedom of association. Basically, I think white nations should be left alone. That's all I'm saying, just left alone. That has nothing whatsoever to do with any kind of supremacy.
I just think that one of the problems I have with white supremacy, like yourself, is that you have an absence of a knowledge of history. You clearly don't understand how history works, rather with regard to white supremacy.
What I must say to you is, if despite judging from the question that he asked earlier, do I have fear of a black planet? If he is looking forward to a black planet, that sounds rather black supremacist to me. But if he insists that he is not a black supremacist, I'll take it as well. But it seems to me to have explained over and over that I'm not by any stretch of the imagination a white supremacist, and then to insist otherwise, I don't know how you have a conversation.
Let's move on to the next question.
My name is Michael Bell.
Yes, sir.
I'm a social activist. I speak up for injustice of any kind.
Then you should be speaking up for whites.
I speak up against ignorant stupidity of any kind as well.
Then why are you here?
Because I believe that what you're saying is stupidity. Anyway, you said that diversity is a strength, and that was a myth. You said that that's a myth, that diversity is a strength, correct?
By and large, it's a weakness. Wherever you find it all around the world.
Okay. But this country was founded on the principles of diversity. This country has been known as the great American melting pot. It wouldn't be what it is today without the other countries who have immigrated to this country.
The United States was founded by Englishmen. If you look at the signers of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, there is not a single name there that I can think of that's not Anglo-Saxon. It's straight up and down the line was. And in fact, John Jay, one of the founders, wrote in the early Federalist Papers that he gave thanks for the fact that this country was populated by people who were so similar to each other in ethnicity, language, religion. He said that gave strength to the United States. And in fact, the very first naturalization law passed in the United States in 1790, this is the very first Congress. One of the decisions they had to make was, who was going to be an American. They got a brand new country. Who is going to be an American? And they said only free white persons were going to be allowed to naturalize as U.S. citizens. Until 1965, the United States had an immigration policy that was designed to keep the country majority white. So it is only very, very recently that people have started this crazy notion that diversity is somehow a strength, whereas, as I say, wherever you look, wherever you find people who are diverse in race, language, religion, whatever it is, when you ever find diverse people trying to live together, you have conflict. And that is part of human nature, and that is why diversity is a source of tension and conflict, not strength.
Can you give him the mic?
You continue to indulge in your white culture.
All right, I have one quick comment and a question. I like that you use SAT scores as a measure of intelligence. I happen to have a perfect 800 on my verbal, which is not affirmative action, that's real, and I happen to still think you're wrong. Okay. I think that there's a question to be asked about the conflation of whiteness and ethnicity, as I believe you were doing many times in that previous question. Many people from this country, as you have stated, are from Germany, are from England, are from countries that you would consider white. But whiteness specifically, in its legal history in America, was codified in laws and customs that were used to do violence to people who were not white, including the people who you would seek to defend. Italians were forced to assimilate into a quote-unquote white culture. So when you say you support a white student union, it seems to me you would have to defend the legal use of whiteness in this country, which was used to do things like justify 3/6 of a man, used to justify Native American discrimination. There's a distinction between affirming the ethnic desire to say I'm German and I'm English, and affirming whiteness as it's been used in America as a legal tool to do violence, slavery, and genocide. So when you say you wish to defend associations, it seems you must also defend that how associations and power structures in this country have been produced is through a history of slavery and genocide. You can't say neutral and move between. So you want to defend the current power configurations that determine associations in American life.
Now, I find this very interesting. You've brought up this 3/5 of a man. You talked about slavery. Did you know that there's a Saudi student union here? Now, Saudi Arabia, as I said before, women don't have any rights there. Saudi Arabia is a dictatorship. There's no democracy there. Saudi Arabia, people who are not Muslims can't practice their religion. Saudi Arabia, I don't know what they do with homosexuals. They hang them, they behead them. There are lots of things wrong with Saudi Arabia today. Now you are in effect saying that Matt Hambach can't have a student union because of slavery. And that was over 150 years ago. Were you here when the Saudi Arabian students got together? Did you drag them over the coals and say, hold on, no, let me finish. Were you here when the Saudi Arabians wanted to organize and say, you answer for this that you're doing today? I'm sure you did not. But you are here asking him to say, because of slavery that happened 150 years ago, you as a white man have no right to organize. Now, I have a hard time taking that seriously.
He asked me a specific question. Sir, I believe you have not answered my argument.
Excuse me?
My argument was that the specific use of whiteness in this country was codified in laws specifically to allocate resources to people who got those resources through violence. Capture of black Africans and Native Americans. So why don't you celebrate a white history as opposed to the English history or the German history? Why specific the color of whiteness, which is a tool for violence, only in this country as opposed to your supposed love of the English German ethnicity?
Because if I walk into Harlem and somebody decides, well, there goes a white guy, and I'm going to attack him because he's white, that person is not going to say, is he German? Is he a Wasp? Is he Italian? No. The crucial aspect of what defines people in this country is not European ethnicity. The things that every other group, a Hispanic or a white or a black or Asian, looks at is race. That is the crucial definition. If there's a race riot, and the Hispanics decide to beat up the whites, so they're going to say, well, we're just going to beat up only the Italian Americans. No. The crucial dividing line is race, and that's why it is the obvious line on which to organize.
So you would defend that created the racial division and maintained the racial division to use the term like whiteness, as opposed to deconstructing race, which seems to be full flat.
The racial divisions exist, whatever we say about them. Race is a biological fact, and pretend otherwise is simply silly.
How you doing? My name is Tendai. My question is a two-part question. The first one I wanted to know, do you define diversity as a race or a cultural issue?
Well, that's a good question. Diversity theoretically has a lot of different elements, as I said in my prepared remarks. Language, religion, all of these things, ethnicity, all of these things, sexual orientation, for example, is diversity. All that goes into diversity. But let's imagine a university here in the United States in which all of the students come from 10 different European countries. 10% are from France, 10% from Italy, 10% from Germany. It would really be a diverse university. But if they were all white, people would say, no, that's not diverse. Because there has to be racial diversity in order for it to be considered genuine diversity. That is the most important ingredient in most people's standards for diversity. I think that if you're talking about diversity, that's in effect an artificial standard, but that's the way it works. So that a university of the kind that I'm describing, I think that if you're interested in the merits and the fascination of diversity, you'd have a fascinatingly diverse university of that kind. But if it were all white, no, that's not diverse. That's not good enough.
Based off that point,
yes.
I have no objections to a white student union because half my family is white.
Well, is that the only reason?
No,
Right.
based on that issue, I also understand that you and others of your complexion have issues as far as getting employment, as far as going to school, because people don't know. I was accepted into MIT a long time ago, but I didn't go there. But if you were Asian, it's harder to get into MIT than if you were black, white, or Mexican, based on the unproportional percent that do apply to MIT.
Yes, exactly.
So there is an issue that others are ignoring here that is not race as you are or they are taking it. It's more basically they are people, just like every one of us, that have issues and they want to come together to talk about those issues. Now, those issues may be disliking others, liking others, not getting along. It doesn't matter. You know, black people get together and they talk about those same things. Why shouldn't they?
Sure. Well, I think that's very fair-minded of you. I salute you. I think most black people, in fact, if you approach them in a reasonable way and say, look, you have interests, you wish to get together with other black people and talk about things that are of interest to you, we as whites wish to do the same thing. I think most black people would say, sure, that sounds entirely fair. Yes, sir.
How you doing? Darryl Jenkins, One People's Project. First of all, before I ask my question, I just want to point out you were born in Japan and you listen to B.B. King, so you're the product of diversity. I mean, you appreciate diversity in your personal life, in your private life, so I don't see why you would have an issue. But I digress from that because I got to point out something here. I think the main reason why a lot of people have an issue with the white student union here at Towson, I see it when you were speaking here today, and the first question you made the point just now. You've just been talking about everyone else. You have not been talking about white culture. You've been more or less complaining about what is being done to white people in your mind or what have you. And to speak to the gentleman's question about white supremacy, you didn't include in your remarks the mantra that you generally use where you say that black people are genetically inferior to whites intellectually.
I have never said that.
You bring up Margaret Jensen, you bring up Phyllis Rushton, they've been at your conferences, but I'll let you respond to that in a minute. My question is, you see a lot of people concerned. This is the concern. Is a white student union here in Towson going to be some sort of tool to lash out at all the other students on campus? Because if that's the case, of course they're going to be upset.
Look. If you were going to organize a student group to lash out at all the other groups, what kind of possible activities would you have? That has never happened among whites on a university campus that I have ever think of. No one ever even wants to do that. In the United States today, the idea of white people getting it, okay, who are we going to attack today? That is absurd, and you know it. Now, when it comes to, no, that's absolutely absurd.
It happened last year.
Furthermore, yes, you said that I've been talking about systematic racial discrimination against whites. Yes, I have. Now, is that not a legitimate grounds for organizing? If blacks were subject to systematic racial discrimination, of course they would organize. You'd be the first to tell them to organize. But for whites, it doesn't count. Whites, there's a double standard. No, for whites, no matter how they are discriminated against, they must not organize. That's your view?
But sir, I've been to your conferences.
I've
been to your conferences. I've seen people there, yeah, the ones that didn't shut down. The conferences included a lot of people, including David Duke, who I met there, that do not share a view that where you say whites should be left alone, everyone else should not be. They talk about white supremacy. I mean, Duke was a member of the Klan. And Stephen Barry, who people don't necessarily know, he tries to form militia groups, racial militia groups. They were there.
Are you holding me responsible for what Stephen Barry does? Is that what you're trying to do? That's just crazy. Yeah, look. If you attended one of my conferences, that means they're open to the public, aren't they? That means that I cannot be held responsible for your views, or for Stephen Barry's views, or for anybody's views who comes to a conference that's open to the public.
Fair enough, but what is there on the podium?
David Duke has never been on the podium. Yes.
Mr. Taylor, thank you for coming. Can you name one thing that motivated you to get into this activism?
One thing. Fairness. Fairness. That's the main thing, yes. I'm very well.
My name is Octavia King. I'm a student here in Towson, and your idea of diversity kind of confuses me. Only because when you say diversity at first, you say you want to celebrate diversity by creating this white student union, and then you want to denounce it by allowing white supremacy in the country. Not white supremacy as you would say, but you know, white supremacy. And so,
let me just do one thing straight. I just want to know what white supremacy is. Now, are you saying that if, hold on, no, let me ask you a question. All I've said is, if white people want to be left alone to meet together, is that white supremacy?
No, that's not what I'm saying. No, I'm not saying, but all you were saying was you want the white majority to last, correct? That's what you were saying.
I think a white country, if it starts out as a white majority, I think that there is no reason why it should replace itself. Absolutely.
No. I don't believe this, only because the people who stepped off that first boat onto this land were not only white. As we know, some black people stepped on there. So there might have been a white majority, but all of you weren't always there. We were there first. And only with westernization, imperialism, and oppression has it come that we act like this, that you guys act like this, like you're more powerful than us. It's not fair that you have oppressed us all of these years, and then you come to complain that I'm the one who's taken away all your rights. That makes no sense to me.
I don't recall saying that you have taken away any of my rights. In any case, no, the whole business, well, what if Nigeria is a black African country. Can we have? But you're saying that whites don't have the right to remain a majority in the United States. What about in Europe? Do they have the right to maintain majorities in Europe? Do Nigerians have the right to maintain an African majority in Nigeria? The Japanese have the right to maintain their majority status in Japan.
I did not say that you don't have the right to. I'm just saying that you're not going to right now. Why?
Well,
because it doesn't make sense that you're oppressing. You oppress everyone since the dawn of time. No, since we came to this country, you oppressed all black people. Is that incorrect?
I think most black people were off in Africa. There was no way we could be oppressing them. How did we oppress the people who were in Africa?
Okay, folks, please settle down. I'm asking very nicely. This is supposed to be a question and answer session. Let's continue with healthy dialogue and healthy conversation, please. Thank you, Shakira.
I believe, in my opinion,
Yes.
that white people have raped and pillaged African countries. And so what I'm saying in America is that slavery has oppressed black people. All the way up until now, we are still oppressed. We have troubles in our school systems and everything, our inner cities. We can't get ourselves together, is what you guys want to say. But you keep telling me that I'm in the way when it comes to affirmative action. I can't get an education.
You can get an education if you qualify for a competitive place. But if you're saying to me, now are you in effect saying that there is nothing unfortunate that ever happened to blacks somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't the fault of white people?
No.
Well, I'm glad of that. No, look.
Diversity.
About diversity. No, you seem to think that we were celebrating diversity with the idea of starting a white student union. No, I'm not celebrating diversity. I think to ask, as I said before, to ask whites to celebrate diversity generally means to ask them to be happy that their numbers are declining and their influence is dwindling. And that I find utterly unfathomable. Yes, sir.
How you doing?
Very well.
I have a question. Correct me if I'm wrong or not. It's your constitutional right to practice religion, assemble, and do that as long as it's not against the law, correct?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. But yet you glorify the Hispanic gang for their strength of diversity. So are you saying is the only way that we can achieve such a strength of a cohesion through systemic violence or illegal means?
Gracious, I didn't think that I was glorifying this gang of Hispanics that are killing blacks, not at all.
You brought it up.
You said they were a very strong gang. They got
Continue, please.
By no means am I glorifying a Hispanic gang that tries to kill black people and expel them from Hawaiian Gardens. I don't know how you could have possibly gotten that idea. I brought them up as an example of the ultimately awful things that can arrive from diversity. That was the only reason I brought that up. And for you to have understood me as having glorified that suggests to me that practically nothing I said was something you understood. I just don't see how you could have misunderstood that.
And yet also, when you were talking about the prison statistics, you said some whites get involved. So are you also not acknowledging that there are Aryan gangs and white supremacy groups in prisons also?
There are white gangs, and one of the reasons they have to form is that they form out of self-defense. An isolated white prison is a very, very vulnerable prison. Also, just hold on, see if you could bear with me. When black and Hispanics end up in prison, often they find a built-in gang because they were members of criminal gangs on the outside. There are very, very few white criminal gangs on the outside. White prison gangs are formed within prisons because so many white prisoners have been raped, beat up, and murdered because they are isolated and they find themselves face to face with blacks and Hispanics and Asians who are organized to form a gang.
Next question, please.
Hi. Am I allowed to hold it? Okay. So I've got a question that I think kind of transcends the racial and cultural barriers that we've been talking about. A lot of the examples that you used were very socioeconomically based. Like a lot of the gangs that start in prisons, most of the people that are in prison are socially economically lower than the average. So and a lot of the examples that you took saying that diversity isn't really a great thing came from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So, crap. So can you give me an example of a very educated group of people that don't enjoy diversity, that think that diversity is bad?
Well, churchgoers. Churchgoers come in all levels.
I said educated.
Well, that certainly sounds like a slur on churchgoers.
No, I'm not saying all churchgoers aren't educated, but I am saying that a large majority of churchgoers aren't as educated. I'm talking about like a group of highly educated college graduates, whether that be like just undergrad or graduate or PhD. How many of them think that diversity is bad.
Have you ever been to Chevy Chase, Maryland? Chevy Chase, Maryland and Potomac, Maryland. They're two of the richest, just out of sight wealthy towns in this area. They're almost exclusively white. Those people could afford to live anywhere in the area. Isn't it odd that these wealthy, college-educated, in many cases, they profess to be liberal white people, somehow find themselves in Chevy Chase or Potomac, Maryland, which is 90 to 95% white. That's a perfect example for me. It's not an accident. As I say, they could live anywhere. And if they genuinely believe in diversity and integration in their own lives, they could undertake a very significant act of integration by buying a house in a black neighborhood, couldn't they? They could sure afford it, but they don't. They live with white people because that's where they're comfortable. Look, even Bill Clinton, while he was president, he was always going on about how diversity is this wonderful, wonderful thing. Well, when he left the White House, where did he end up buying a house? In Chappaqua, New York. It's about as white a place this side of Iceland. These people are spectacular hypocrites. They talk about how wonderful diversity and integration is. Look at how they live. Look at who they invite to their dinner parties. Look at where they send their children to school. If you were to ask a big liberal congressman, if you were to ask him, name a single majority non-white school you'd like to send your children to, you'd put him right on the spot. These people are pathetic hypocrites, but they are examples of educated and people who describe themselves as liberals, who in their lives, not in what they say, but in the way they live, what they really do with their lives, they turn their backs on diversity just as firmly as a Ku Klux Klan.
Clinton's office is in Harlem, just to throw that out there.
Yeah,
It's in Harlem, New York.
and he spends hardly any time there, and he only moved it there.
You know him?
He moved it there only because first he wanted to have it in Trump Tower, right in the heart of Manhattan. He got so much criticism for that. I think he's moved out of Harlem anyway. He goes in with a police escort.
Just a reminder, folks. Just a reminder. In the interest of time, this is not designed to be a debate right now. This is a question and answer session, please. So if you're here with a question, please ask the question. Please answer the question.
Yes, sir.
Yes, they're on. Yes, they're on. Back again. Now, just before I start off, I just want to reiterate, I'm not against, and I don't want to speak for everyone else, but I'm not against a white student union.
Good.
I'm against what's been known as, I don't want to say whites because that's probably improper, but when Caucasians, white Americans usually get together, it's for violent purposes, as I've stated before and as was stated before. That's the only reason why we don't want the white student. It's not that we don't want the white student union. We don't want to have an organization on campus. Now, you're not going to come together and protest, oh, we're going to go and kill this and this many black people today, this and this many Spanish people.
No, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I understand that, but what ends up happening is that you end up discussing certain topics and certain notions and certain ideas that encourage people to sort of take out other races. But that's not my argument. That's just me sort of starting off. That's my warm-up.
Get to the question.
Yeah, I'm getting to my question. First thing that I want to mention is that you said that people do not enjoy diversity. They don't look for diversity. Is this correct?
By and large, some people do, but most don't.
And this is correct.
Yeah.
Because people tend to hang out with people of like-minded interests, like-minded views, like-minded this, that, and the third.
Entirely true.
But just because groups associate with like-minded views does not mean that they anticipate and they put down other races in the same time.
I agree 100%.
That's my first point. So people don't need diversity, but diversity is something that's encouraged. You said something about when whites going to Mexico and taking over Mexico and make them all speak English and make them all do this and all the American way. Yeah. Now, of course,
they wouldn't stand for it, would they?
No, they wouldn't.
No.
And it goes back to the first notion about the Native Americans when white Americans came over here to America and they took over the Native American race. Same example.
The point is, they did their best to stop it. But if whites were to try to stop this demographic transformation, they would be considered bigots. Why is it legitimate for the Indians to try to stop it, but it's illegitimate for whites to stop dispossession? That's yet again another double standard. Now, one thing you said, when whites get together, it's for violence. Well, I don't think, if you go to the Kennedy Center for a performance of opera, you're going to find almost all white people there. They sure don't have violence on their mind. If you go to NASCAR, all those white people, they don't have violence on their mind. If you go to an art museum or a cocktail,
There, come on, please.
white people come together all the time for perfectly innocent reasons. Thank you.
Sorry.
I think we have the next question.
I know, but I wait in line. I just want to make this quick. You are correct that when all white people get together, it's not for violent events. Same way when all African Americans get together, we're not shooting up the place and we're not making a fool of ourselves. But when Caucasians and white Americans get in groups like these, it's been shown, proven, in these particular groups talking about white culture, white America, that it's just sort of encouraging the notion and the thought that white Americans own this country and white Americans have the right to be in this country. White Americans have the right to control other races.
Wait, you're going too far. I think white Americans do have the right to be in this country. I'm not saying they have the right to control other races. You are confusing two very different important things. Now, please, next question. She's waiting.
Hi, Mr. Taylor.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious about the nature of how you are actually personally dealing with this issue as far as trying to organize a white supremacy organization.
I'm not going to answer that question.
Okay, I have another question that you probably can answer. Along with that, you know, as American and as all Americans in here, one nation under God, is it really going to be pleasing to God to see that He wants you to, you're favoring one ethnic group? One group. Now, you mean to tell me that a black woman from Morgan State University, a historically black university, okay? And we have Native Americans there, we have white people there, we have all a plethora of races there, okay? So you mean to tell me that only your race should be a qualified applicant for your organization?
No,
what if I wanted to be a part of it?
From what I understand the way the rules work in this university, anyone can apply.
And you know, when you started, I can almost bet my life that it will be destroyed.
Well, destroyed? Well, that sounds like another double standard. I can't think of...
Next question, please.
Well, no, I think this is an important point. The group is going to be destroyed. I can't think of any other racially or ethnically based group that was going to be destroyed. I think it's very important that we dwell on this comment here.
Next question.
Very good.
For you. Okay. That's your kid.
We're about to ask the next question, please.
Mr. Taylor, first of all, thank you for coming to speak with us today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. It's very stimulating.
Absolutely. It's been fun. My question has to do with practical politics. With the Democratic Party essentially now being pretty much the party that panders and wants the non-white vote. And the fact that non-whites vote the majority of non-whites vote Democratic. And with the Republican Party also pandering for those same votes at the same time. In the future, say 20 or 30 years, do you think that there is going to be a place in American politics for European Americans in the two-party system, or do you think there's a possibility of a third party coming integrated?
That's a very difficult question. I think an easier question would be to say that I think the Republicans are making a huge mistake. The only way that they could possibly get blacks and Hispanics to vote for them is to become more Democratic than the Democrats, and then they cease to be Republicans. I think that if the Republicans had any sense at all, they would recognize that their main base of support is whites, and that they should be talking about some of the things that I've been talking about. Immigration, racial preferences. I think they should consolidate that. And I think they're also fair-minded non-whites, like this gentleman here said that whites should have the right to organize. Some of those people who believe in small government, they too would support a Republican Party. But for the Republicans to decide, well, we're just going to be just like the Democrats, then why be Republicans? I think that's suicide. 20 or 30 years from now, hard to say. I think there's still, 150 million white people in this country. I think more and more white people are realizing that they have gotten the shaft. More and more white people are realizing that this notion that somehow it's virtuous to stand aside, to give this country that their ancestors built to newcomers from all over the world is a crazy thing. I think more whites are going to realize that. What form their realization will take, I do not know, whether it be the third party, whether it be white student unions. In any case, I think whites will gradually dawn on them that they have legitimate rights that only they will defend, because nobody else can care about the rights of whites. I think we have evidence of the way people have reacted in this room. None of the non-whites here seem to think, except with a few brave exceptions, none of the non-whites here seem to think that whites have any legitimate interest at all. That's an astonishing state of affairs.
Hey, Mr. Taylor, thank you for coming to Towson.
My pleasure.
I just have two quick questions. Number one, you have a lot of fans in the room, obviously. I was wondering if
Ask the question to the speaker, please.
I was wondering if you could give maybe a link or a quick shout out to where we could purchase more of your materials.
Well, our website is amren.com. That stands for American Renaissance. That's our main link to the world.
My second quick question is, there's a talking point that's fairly popular. The talking point is this: race does not exist, right? It's a social construct. If that is true, and I've heard that talking point repeated throughout this audience this evening, if that's true, isn't a black student union illegitimate as well? And how can we define black interest if there is no such thing as blackness to begin with? Isn't everybody here being hypocritical?
Yes, that is an excellent question. And in fact, one point I like to make is this whole idea that race is an optical illusion is so wrong and so stupid that only very intelligent people could possibly persuade themselves that it's true. You very seldom hear black people saying race is a myth, because they know very well race is not a myth. They have a racial identity, they have racial interests. It's only weird white people, by and large, who ever come up with this cuckoo idea. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Celeste Damalo. I have two questions. Years ago, people came here for freedom. Statue of Liberty clearly stated, that immigrants wanted freedom. That's why they came here to this country. Correct? And you embrace diversity. Excuse me, that's not my question.
Oh, okay.
You embrace diversity. You embrace diversity at those points. But now that you guys are seeming to be the minority, I'm sorry, I don't mean to say you guys, the Caucasians, I'm sorry, are seeming to be the minority, there's a problem, and that I don't understand. And I would like to understand, for the problem of diversity, what do you see that you should do to get rid of this problem? Because how can you get rid of diversity once you brought it to the country?
Well, first of all, I think most people came to this country primarily for economic reasons, wherever they came from. The idea that they came quoting Thomas Jefferson or quoting the U.S. Constitution, no. They come to this country because they think they can make a better life. Let's be frank about it. As far as the Statue of Liberty is concerned, the Statue of Liberty was never built as originally to celebrate immigration. It was built to celebrate the 200th anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution. It was liberty enlightening the world. It had nothing to do with liberty enlightening the world, not inviting the world. But as far as diversity is concerned, I think that, sure, once people are here, there's a certain amount of diversity, and that's inevitable. But I think that it is spectacularly stupid to build a country on what amounts to a lie. Why should we go about repeating this silly idea that diversity is a strength when in fact it's a weakness? I think it's always a mistake to build a society on something that is simply not true. Furthermore, if we recognize this fundamental truth that diversity is a weakness and not a strength, then I think obviously you would stop immigration. Immigration is contributing.
How do you feel it is best to go about getting rid of diversity?
Well, I don't think you can get rid of it, but you can stop its increasing. Yes, I think I would stopping immigration. That would be the best way to do it.
We have about 10 more minutes left. Please don't go out of line. If you do have a question, let's keep it brief so we get to everybody we can and get a brief answer so we can move forward, so we can hear everybody.
Let her hold it. Let her hold it.
I just feel as though the people of this white student union group are racist. Like, that's just how I feel. Like, you just have a problem with minorities. I feel like when I am actually a black alumni.
Please let me ask you, okay? Please ask the question so we can move forward with this.
Okay. Okay, affirmative action was your primary point of why Towson needs a white student union. My question to you is, because your statistics suggest that if everyone was held to the same standards, that mostly white people would be admitted because the black people would not qualify because of affirmative action.
In most institutions, that's the case.
Okay, but are you considering the history of why some minorities may not have had the same rights as whites historically, which may be the reason why, our test scores may be lower or something like that? You're not considering that. So why shouldn't we have the same opportunities as you, being as though we were not afforded those rights back in the day?
Many people make that argument that because blacks suffer discrimination, that there has to be compensation for the injustices of the past, and that justifies affirmative action racial preferences. Well, the fact is, young people applying to university today, they have lived in the United States that has been practicing affirmative action ever since they were born. It's very difficult to say that young black people today suffered some kind of egregious racial discrimination that must be compensated for. And that is why today, when people talk about justifications for affirmative action racial preferences, they're no longer talking about making up for Jim Crow. Jim Crow ended in the 1950s. What they're talking about is it has become the explanation for affirmative action has now become diversity, because the whole notion that we're making up for slavery, that idea has so become transparently threadbare.
Next question.
My name is Jab Haynes, transfer student representative from Morgan State University. In 1865, slavery was deemed illegal in America. Slavery generated millions of dollars over 2 centuries. Should corporations formed before 1865 be required to acknowledge which financial contributions originated from free slave labor?
Are you talking about the reparations, presumably?
Let me repeat the question. Should corporations formed before 1865 be required to acknowledge which financial contributions originated from free slave labor?
No, I don't think so. What would be the point of, say, well, there were very few corporations that existed before 1865, and what would be the purpose of saying what proportion of your revenues came from slavery related? If you sold clothes to a slave owner and he dressed his slaves with them, is that sort of an illegitimate profit? If you paid a dentist to fix your slave's teeth, is the dentist somehow to be held culpable for that? No, I don't see the benefit of that kind of
Second question. Aside from the establishment of American government, what positive aspects of American culture can be solely attributed to Anglo-Saxons?
What positive? Well, I think Mark Twain is an Anglo-Saxon. I think he wrote great books. I think there are many Anglo-Saxon authors. I think Anglo-Saxons built the first universities in this country. Yale was certainly founded. Harvard was founded by Anglo-Saxons. Anglo-Saxons built all the institutions that this started off with. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, all of the constitutional rights, all of these were founded by Anglo-Saxons. Anglo-Saxons built the institutions on which this country is founded, every last one.
Next question. One question, please, in the interest of time.
Okay, I have a response to what you were saying about if whites were to migrate into Mexico, that Mexican government and the Mexican community or culture would be upset that whites were trying to take over and trying to diminish the white culture. You do realize that in the world population, that brown-skinned people outnumber the number of white people around the world.
Yeah.
Therefore, it is quite possible that within the next 80 years, next 100 years, that you guys will be outnumbered because there's too many. But there's too many. But you're trying to say you're trying to stop that. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. There are too many brown people around the world compared to the number of white Anglo-Saxons that live in the world. That those numbers. Go ahead.
Japanese people are a very small minority in the world. They're a very small minority, but they have an immigration policy essentially of zero. They have this quaint notion that they want Japan to stay Japanese, and so they're not going to let people. Are you telling me that wherever non-brown people live, are the Japanese going to be forcibly invaded and kicked off their island by all these brown people you're talking about?
Next question, man.
Okay. I was wondering, why do you use Nigeria to compare?
I could use Ivory Coast. I could
Okay,
use
well,
Ghana,
specifically,
I could use Botswana.
specifically, why did you use Nigeria? I want to know that question.
First came to mind. I could have used Ivory Coast.
Okay, no, but specifically in terms of how. That's what he said. Answer my question. So.
Well, okay. It could have been Kenya. It could have been Uganda. It could have been Botswana. Next question.
Hello, my name's Indigo Potter, and my question really isn't for you because you haven't seemed to be answering the true questions that we want to know. You don't I don't feel any easier about this whole white student union thing. So is there are you the guy who's trying to get somebody? Is there a perspective of white student union person who can answer my question? You? Okay, like, you keep saying you have all these interests, like, what are your interests, and what are you going to talk about? Like, the first person asked, what are you guys going to talk about? What is the purpose? That question was never answered. What is the purpose? Like, what are you guys going to do?
Sure, go ahead. Answer the question.
Well, I think the biggest issue that the fact that you have to ask, what are we going to talk about, that I've never gone to a black student union meeting and asked what y'all are going to talk about. Hold on. Now, the fact that white students want to politically organize and address the issues that Mr. Taylor was talking about, immigration is an issue that is facing every single white country. Demographics, because in no white country are whites even equal to replacement rate in terms of birth rate. Affirmative action, racial preferences. There's a whole host of issues. In Maryland, we have another county that's looking to make English the official language. I think that's something that would interest white students. So there's a whole host of issues. So I'm not really sure what the question is, because we have so many different issues that we've already announced we're going to be talking about, especially Mr. Taylor, the issues that he's discussing. So. Okay.
Well, I'm very sorry for all of you who were unable to ask your questions. I apologize, but apparently the authorities have told us the time's up. And I'd like to thank you, sir, for running this meeting the way you did. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.